Welcome to The Psychology of Us. This podcast is created by RJ Starr, a public intellectual and independent psychology educator. The material presented is educational and interpretive, examining psychological life as a domain of understanding rather than intervention. It does not provide therapy, diagnosis, or professional guidance. Each episode stands as a complete work of public psychological inquiry.
Have you ever wondered why, under the exact same type of stress, one person stays completely calm and curious, while another person just completely loses their cool?
Or perhaps they just shut down entirely.
Right. Exactly. Picture this for a second if you're listening. You could have two people facing the exact same project deadline at work.
Yeah.
Or they receive the exact same piece of critical feedback from a boss, or get into the exact same argument with a partner, but their internal systems react in wildly different ways.
Yeah, completely different.
One person, takes a breath, maybe asks a clarifying question, and the other person either starts yelling or completely withdraws into a shell. Why does that actually happen?
It is a phenomenal question. And frankly, it is the central puzzle we are exploring today. We are looking at a really brilliant, comprehensive model called the Emotional Maturity Index.
Which is just a fascinating body of work.
It really is.
Yeah.
It was created by the independent psychology educator and scholar, Professor RJ Starr. And the reason we're dedicating this deep dive to Starr's work is that it completely changes the lens through which we view human behavior under pressure.
Yeah, it really shifts the perspective.
It moves us away from judgment and firmly towards mechanics.
I have been looking forward to this deep dive all week. We have this massive stack of Professor Starr's writings and research sitting right in front of us.
Quite a stack, yeah.
And I think our primary mission today is to take that phrase, emotional maturity, and completely strip away the moral judgments we usually attach to it. Because we throw that term around a lot, don't we?
Oh, constantly.
Usually as an insult. You see someone lose their temper and you think, oh, they're acting so emotionally immature. It's a judgment on their character.
Right, it becomes a moral failing.
Exactly. But Starr's work forces us to understand emotion not as some fixed personality trait or a measure of how good or bad you are, but as a dynamic structural system. It's part of what he calls our broader psychological architecture.
And if we look at the bigger picture of Starr's research, what provides the absolute most value here for you listening is understanding the actual mechanics. How do our minds stabilize when things get intense?
Because it's a mechanical process.
Precisely. Professor Starr is not interested in giving us a checklist of, polite behaviors versus rude behaviors. He is mapping human affective regulation.
Right.
When the pressure hits, how does your nervous system, your sense of self, and your worldview structurally hold together? Or, conversely, how does it fall apart?
Okay, let's unpack that, because I had a massive aha moment right at the beginning of reading Starr's work. He goes out of his way to make it crystal clear that the Emotional Maturity Index is not a psychometric test.
No, not at all.
Like, you listening to this right now cannot sit down, fill out a multiple choice quiz on the internet, and get a score out of 100 that tells you if you are a mature person or an immature person.
It's a very common misconception.
And it's definitely not a therapeutic framework designed to make you feel guilty. In Professor Starr's model, immaturity isn't a character defect.
And that shift in perspective, that's really the foundation of this entire deep dive. Starr explicitly defines the Emotional Maturity Index as a structural taxonomy.
Hold on. Structural taxonomy? That sounds incredibly academic. Can we translate that into plain English for a second?
Fair enough. Simply put, it means he classifies emotional responses based on how they're built and how they function, not what they look like on the surface.
Okay, that makes sense.
When Starr talks about emotional maturity, he defines it structurally. It is the capacity of your affective system to metabolize intense emotion without collapsing.
And by collapsing, he means what exactly?
It means the system literally cannot handle the load. So it falls into impulsive discharge, complete avoidance, distorted perception, or what he terms rigid narrative consolidation.
So locking into a stubborn, highly defensive story about what is happening just to make the uncomfortable feeling go away.
That is a very accurate translation, yes. The system essentially defaults to a simplified, rigid story because the complexity of the actual emotion is simply too heavy to hold.
Wow. This reframes so much for me. If your system gets overwhelmed and you snap at your partner, or you hide in your room to avoid a difficult conversation, Professor Starr is arguing that isn't you being a fundamentally flawed person.
Exactly. It's not a character flaw.
That is just a predictable mechanical configuration. The sheer intensity of the emotion overrode your structural capacity to process it.
Yes. And to really grasp how this works, we have to look at the two organizing principles Starr outlines for how human beings handle stress.
Right, let's get into those.
The first principle is called reactive stabilization. This is what occurs when the affective intensity, the raw emotion, is simply too much for the system to bear.
So the system is overloaded.
Exactly. And the brain's priority immediately becomes restoring equilibrium at all costs.
Yeah.
So what are the options? You discharge the emotion by yelling.
Or throwing something.
Right. Or you aggressively suppress it and pretend everything is fine. Or you externalize it by instantly blaming someone else.
It totally reminds me of a quick pressure release valve. You use it, and you get this immediate short-term relief because the internal pressure drops.
Feels good in the moment.
Yeah. You might feel a rush of relief for a split second after snapping at your boss or sending a really passive-aggressive email, but the side effect is that it completely narrows your perspective.
That's the danger.
It's like installing a cheap pressure release valve that just accidentally floods your entire basement.
Here.
You temporarily solved the pressure problem inside the pipe, but you've created a massive mess everywhere else.
That is a perfect analogy. The problem is that the immediate relief is highly reinforcing to the brain. The brain learns that yelling or running away reduces the acute stress.
So it maps that as a successful survival strategy.
Precisely. But the alternative to that, the second organizing principle in Starr's framework, is differentiated regulation.
And this is the goal, right?
This is the actual core of structural emotional maturity. It reflects the capacity to sustain emotional activation long enough for reflective processing to actually occur.
Wait, I want to challenge this a bit. Because when I hear differentiated regulation and the idea of sustaining the emotion, it sounds an awful lot like we are just supposed to bury our feelings to keep the peace.
I see where you're going with that.
Like, isn't that emotional dampening?
Yeah.
Aren't we told constantly not to bottle things up?
It is a crucial distinction, and I'm glad you brought it up. Differentiated regulation is absolutely not emotional dampening.
Okay.
Professor Starr emphasizes that maturity doesn't mean you feel less, or that you turn into an unfeeling robot who just politely nods through trauma.
Good, because that sounds exhausting.
Right. You still feel the intense anger, the grief, or the frustration, but it is structured integration. You are tolerating the intensity of that feeling in your body without immediately acting on the urge to discharge it or flee from it.
You hold the feeling while maintaining your perspective.
Exactly. You stay engaged.
So the obvious question for anyone listening is, why do I default to the messy pressure valve while someone else seems to naturally have this differentiated regulation? Are they just born with better hardware?
Starr argues that our emotional systems stabilize through reinforcement over time. And this brings us to the role of our personal histories.
How we were raised.
Yes, early conditioning. The relational modeling we observe from our parents or caregivers and cultural norms, they write the implicit rules for our psychological architecture.
They lay the foundation.
They dictate which emotions are permissible for you to feel and how those emotions must be managed to keep you safe and attached to your community.
I was reading this section of his work, and it hit me how much sense this makes. Under stress, Starr says we inevitably regress to our most rehearsed configurations.
We go back to what we know.
Yeah. If your rehearsed configuration from childhood was to withdraw into absolute silence the second a conflict started, because maybe that was literally the only way to stay safe in your house, then that is the structural response your system will default to 30 years later when your boss critiques a spreadsheet.
It's not a pathology. It's just the architecture you built to survive.
It's so validating to hear it framed that way. But how does this architecture actually function in real time?
To understand the real-time mechanics, we have to contextualize the emotional maturity index within the rest of RJ Starr's psychological architecture framework.
Because emotion doesn't happen in a vacuum.
Right. It interacts constantly in a bidirectional loop with two other major domains that Starr maps out: identity and meaning.
And here is where the research gets incredibly practical. Think about how a sudden spike in emotion affects your mind and your sense of meaning.
It's a dramatic shift.
I noticed Starr claims that when we are in that state of reactive stabilization, when we are overwhelmed and just trying to discharge the pressure, our attention actually physically and cognitively narrows. Is that a literal biological response?
It is. When the system is overwhelmed, cognitive processing accelerates toward restoring coherence. You cannot handle nuance, so you simplify the situation.
Everything becomes black and white.
Exactly. You externalize blame to make sense of the discomfort. Your meaning framework becomes highly defensive and reductionistic. You might immediately categorize a totally neutral event as a deliberate injustice.
Or a confirmation of some prior grievance you've been holding on to?
Yes, the narrative locks in instantly. But in a differentiated system, the response is entirely different.
Right. Starr points out that when you can regulate and tolerate the emotional weight, your meaning remains provisional. You can actually tolerate ambiguity.
You don't immediately jump to a catastrophic conclusion.
Exactly. If a friend doesn't text you back for 2 days, you don't immediately lock into the narrative of, they secretly hate me, I am fundamentally unlovable, and I'm going to end the friendship before they can.
Which is a very common reactive narrative.
Oh, absolutely. But if you are regulated, you can just sit with the uncomfortable ambiguity of not knowing why they haven't replied.
The counterintuitive part of this model, though, is that this bidirectional loop flows backward, too.
What do you mean by backward?
It isn't just that your emotions dictate your meaning and identity. Your identity and meaning frameworks dictate your emotions. They condition the amplitude of your emotional activation well before any regulation even begins.
Okay, let's translate that into a real-world scenario for the listener. Let's say my core identity is built around being the smartest person in the room. Or maybe it's built around moral perfection.
Two very rigid identity structures.
Right. If that is my identity structure, then every single minor critique I receive is going to feel like a structural earthquake, right?
Yes, because in Starr's terminology, the critique becomes an ontological threat.
Meaning it feels like an attack on who I fundamentally am as a person, rather than just a comment on the work I did.
Precisely. If your identity requires you to be flawless to have worth, a tiny piece of negative feedback is an existential danger.
The stakes are incredibly high.
The stakes are your very survival as a coherent self. The emotional intensity spikes massively because the system floods before you even have a chance to consciously process the feedback.
But if we flip that, and your identity narrative includes fallibility, if you actively see yourself as a messy human being who makes mistakes but has the ability to learn and repair them, your system inherently has more bandwidth.
The activation is experienced as a situational challenge, not a threat to your existence.
It's profound because the exact same stressor produces a completely different level of emotional arousal simply because of the identity framework it passes through.
It is profound. And understanding this structural goal of regulation leads us to one of the most revealing aspects of Starr's work, the failure modes.
Oh, this section is going to hit very close to home for you listening.
It usually does. Recalibrating our emotional system is not a linear journey. Often our attempts at growth actually activate the very defense mechanisms we are trying to outgrow.
Because these are the ways we think we are being mature, but we are actually faking it. Professor Starr outlines 4 specific failure modes where we simulate maturity, but are actually utilizing highly refined defensive strategies.
Highly sophisticated strategies.
I know I saw myself in several of these. Let's start with the first one Starr identifies. Performative regulation.
This failure mode is incredibly prevalent today. This occurs when an individual uses all the correct therapeutic terminology. They appear incredibly composed, calm, and deliberate on the outside.
But internally?
Internally, they're suppressing the emotional charge. They're simulating regulation through impression management.
They want to look mature.
Yes, they want to appear like the most mature person in the room to avoid social judgment, but the internal affective activation is still entirely dominating their nervous system.
It's the HR speak defense. It's when someone says in a perfectly flat voice, I feel that your energy is not serving my space right now, and I am honoring my journey by walking away.
A perfect example.
Meanwhile, internally, they are practically vibrating with unaddressed rage. They aren't integrating the emotion at all. They're just acting out a script of maturity.
The system appears composed, but it remains structurally organized around rigid self-monitoring rather than true integration. You're managing optics, not emotions.
Which is exhausting.
It is. And this often transitions into the second failure mode, hyper-reflective rumination.
Okay, this is the trap of the overthinker. And I am so guilty of this one.
Many analytical people are. In this configuration, the emotional activation isn't discharged outwardly through yelling or aggression. Instead, it is endlessly overanalyzed without ever reaching a point of resolution.
So you just think in circles.
The individual repeatedly interprets their feelings, substituting cognitive elaboration for actual emotional integration.
And the crazy part is, it looks like deep introspection. Society praises this. We call it emotional intelligence.
We reward it.
I have literally spent 3 days journaling about why an offhand comment from a friend annoyed me. I mapped out their childhood trauma, my childhood trauma, the societal context of the comment. I thought I was being so enlightened.
But reading Starr's work.
Reading Starr's work, I realized I was just terrified to actually confront my friend and say, hey, that hurt my feelings.
That's a perfect illustration. Structurally, hyper-reflective rumination is an avoidance of vulnerability.
You hide in your head.
You are hiding in your intellect, so you do not have to actually feel the visceral discomfort of the emotion in your body or take the relational risk of addressing it. You substitute thinking about the feeling for actually feeling the feeling.
You were just spinning the wheels without the car ever moving forward. Which leads us to the third failure mode, which Starr calls the moralization of reactivity.
This one is particularly damaging.
This is the shame spiral. This is when you judge yourself for having an emotional reaction in the first place. You feel a flash of jealousy or anger, and you immediately think, I shouldn't be angry. A truly mature, enlightened person wouldn't feel jealous.
The tragic irony of this mode, as Starr maps it out, is that introducing judgment introduces shame into the regulatory loop.
And shame is heavy.
Shame is an incredibly intense, heavy emotion. So by judging your initial natural reaction, you have just magnified the total emotional intensity that your system now has to stabilize.
We really need to pause on that insight because it's huge. By beating yourself up for feeling stressed, you are literally adding more stress to the system. You are doubling the load.
Exactly. It becomes a self-punitive cycle. The psychological architecture actually narrows further under the weight of that evaluative self-criticism.
Because maturity is completely misconstrued as the total absence of negative emotion, rather than the capacity to metabolize it.
Precisely. And that brings us to the fourth failure mode, rigid boundary absolutism.
You see this everywhere online right now. There is a huge trend of cutting people off, ghosting friends, or preemptively avoiding any situation that might cause conflict and calling it setting boundaries.
If we look at this through the lens of relational functioning, differentiation is being misinterpreted here as complete detachment.
The emotion goes away, sure.
The emotional intensity is reduced, certainly, but it is reduced through relational withdrawal and categorical exclusion. You avoid the conflict, which drops your immediate stress levels, but you systematically destroy your relational elasticity.
It's weaponized avoidance masquerading as empowerment.
That's a very sharp way to put it.
You limit any opportunities for co-regulation, for compromise, or for repairing a rupture. It gives the outward appearance of strength and independence, but beneath it, your psychological architecture is actually shrinking because it can't handle the friction of other human beings.
However, Starr offers a very reassuring perspective on these failure modes. It's important to note these are not permanent, broken states.
Right, there's hope.
If you find yourself over-intellectualizing or building rigid walls, you aren't fundamentally defective. It simply demonstrates that under threat, our minds naturally default to familiar, rehearsed stabilization strategies.
Your brain is just trying to keep you safe using the tools it currently trusts the most.
Exactly.
But that makes me wonder, why do we break down using these failure modes in some situations, but hold together perfectly fine in others?
It's a matter of context.
Because I know people who are completely unflappable in a corporate crisis, but they fall to pieces if their partner uses a slightly weird tone of voice at dinner. High emotional intensity clearly doesn't always equal an immature response.
According to Starr's research, your regulatory behavior heavily depends on the type of strain the system is experiencing, not just the raw volume of the emotion.
So not all stress is created equal.
No. He breaks down 3 interacting domains of strain. The first is physiological strain. This is high autonomic arousal. You are physically exhausted, you are fighting off a virus, or you haven't slept in 2 days. Your nervous system is redlining.
Makes sense. The battery is physically drained. What's the second?
The second is identity strain. This occurs when the activation directly implicates your core self structures. This is the realm we discussed earlier: criticism, exclusion, failure, or betrayal.
Because it attacks who you are?
This type of strain can trigger massive regulatory destabilization, even if your physiological intensity started out quite low, because it threatens your definition of yourself.
And the third domain is meaning strain. This is when an event destabilizes the interpretive framework that gives your life continuity, fairness, and purpose.
Exactly right.
Think of experiencing a profound loss, witnessing a severe injustice, or dealing with existential uncertainty, your map of how the world works is suddenly torn up and thrown out the window.
What STAR reveals is how these three domains interact. Your differentiation bandwidth, your ability to stay mature and regulated, is severely compressed when physiological, identity, and meaning strain all converge at the exact same time.
But if one or two of those are secure,
If one or two of those domains are highly secure, you can handle incredible amounts of stress in the third.
let's put this in a real-world scenario so you listening can picture it. Think about doing a brutal, high-intensity workout at the gym.
The physiological strain is off the charts.
Right. Your heart rate is maxed, your muscles are burning, you are literally in pain. But you easily handle it. You don't sit down on the gym floor and have an emotional breakdown.
Because your identity and your meaning frameworks are totally secure.
Yes, you know why you're doing it, and it aligns with your identity as someone who values fitness.
The context dictates the capacity.
Exactly. Because later that same day, a coworker makes a minor passing criticism about a presentation you poured your heart into.
The physiological strain starts at zero.
You are rested, you are sitting at a desk. But because the identity stakes are so high, because you pride yourself on being a top performer, you totally destabilize. You snap at them, or you spiral into a hyper-reflective anxiety loop.
STAR's framework proves that we react relative to the composition of the strain.
So knowing all of this structural theory, the inevitable question is, how do we actually recalibrate? How do we develop this structural emotional maturity if we are currently stuck in reactive patterns?
According to RJ Starr, it requires modifying our structural reinforcement.
Right, because we established earlier that reactive stabilization, like yelling or withdrawing, gives us that immediate hit of relief, and our brains love that reward.
To grow, Starr says we have to start tolerating emotional signals as data rather than as immediate threats to our survival.
We have to sit with the discomfort.
We have to sit with it long enough that the brain physically learns a new neural pathway. That sustained coherence and relational connection are actually better long-term rewards than immediate explosive relief.
But crucially, Starr argues that this recalibration cannot be done in isolation, can it?
No, it requires what he terms relational restructuring. Emotional maturity develops in interactive contexts.
You need other people.
You need to be in environments, whether that is a secure romantic relationship, a supportive workplace, or a therapeutic setting that permit vulnerability without punishing you for it.
Because if you try to practice vulnerability in an environment that rewards reactivity or punishes honesty, you will just re-entrench your old defensive configuration.
Exactly.
I love this point because it cuts through so much modern self-help advice. You cannot just meditate your way to emotional maturity while sitting alone on a mountain. Differentiation happens at the exact boundary of destabilization and safety.
You need enough relational strain to challenge your system, but enough external safety and support to prevent you from completely collapsing while you learn a new way to process the emotion.
It is a profound and highly systemic model of human development. And as we pull all of these concepts together, it is vital to remember that the Emotional Maturity Index is just one component of Professor RJ Starr's massive psychological architecture.
This framework sits alongside other structural models he has developed.
Like the identity collapse cycle.
Yes, which maps how we destabilize when our societal roles dissolve, or his extensive work on emotional repatterning. Together, they form a unified account of how human beings actually develop, adapt, and operate.
It is truly a masterclass in understanding the mechanics of ourselves. So what is the ultimate takeaway for you today? Starr's work teaches us that true emotional maturity isn't about feeling less.
It's not about being stoic.
Or using perfect therapy speak to manage optics, or never getting angry. It is about increasing your architectural capacity to integrate intense, messy, uncomfortable feelings without losing your identity, without losing your perspective, and without destroying your relationships.
It requires structural adaptation, moving from a fragile system that demands immediate relief at any cost to a robust system that prioritizes sustained coherence and connection.
It is an ongoing practice of expanding your capacity, not a permanent destination you simply arrive at.
Absolutely.
I want you to take a second today and reflect on your own go-to stabilization strategies. When the pressure hits at work or at home, what is your default architectural response?
Do you discharge the emotion onto others?
Do you withdraw behind rigid walls? Do you over-intellectualize and journal for days to avoid a real conversation? Ask yourself, in those moments, are you actually regulating your system, or are you just desperately seeking immediate relief?
It's a challenging question to face, honestly, but an incredibly necessary one if we want to expand our capacity for life and connection.
And I want to leave you with one final provocative thought to mull over on your own. If Professor Starr is right, that our emotional systems literally reorganize through lived corrective experiences and relational restructuring, rather than just abstract intellectual insight, then all the self-help books and deep dives in the world won't actually change your structural maturity on their own.
Insight is not enough.
You actually have to risk staying engaged in the messy, highly uncomfortable moments with other human beings. You can't do it alone in a vacuum. So the next time you feel that intense, overwhelming urge to instantly discharge your stress, or to withdraw behind rigid boundaries, or to over-intellectualize your feelings just to escape the vulnerability, what would happen if you just sat with the data for 5 more seconds?
This has been The Psychology of Us. The work presented here is part of a public psychological archive by RJ Starr. It is educational and interpretive, not clinical or advisory. Episodes are published as finished reflections and are intended to be encountered as complete works.